Good afternoon from Jakarta. Welcome to FPCI Virtual Public Discussion. This public discussion is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, the largest foreign policy group in Indonesia and Southeast Asia with over 100,000 people in our network. Before we begin, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to give a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers today who have joined us, Mr. Steven Ciobo, the Managing Director, the Head of Global Affairs of Stonepeak Infrastructure Partners, who is also the Minister for Trade of Australia back in 2016 to 2018. We would also like to welcome Mr. Muhamad Chatib Basri, the Minister of Finance of Indonesia back in 2013 to 2014. Welcome to FPCI Public Discussion. We are joined by participants coming from various countries today, from Philippines, South Korea, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Australia, Brunei, UK, Zambia, Hungary, South Africa, Japan. Welcome, everyone. So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, today we will be discussing an important issue. Emerging markets such as Indonesia, for example, China, Brazil, are currently facing constant challenges. Among others, we have global inflation, food crisis, supply chain disruption, domestic instability, international conflicts, and many others. Therefore, today we will be discussing about it with a session entitled Emerging Markets, Anticipating Strong Headwinds. Without further ado, let me invite the moderator of today's session, our founder and chairman, Dr. Dino Patti Djalal. Dr. Dino, you may take over.
Thank you, Jen. This is Dino Jalal, and I want to welcome all the participants to this webinar. I'm always surprised to see how many countries are joining this, and Jen could not mention each of them by name, but all of you are welcome. And today we have a very interesting topic, which is the headwinds that are being faced by emerging markets these days. I'm involved a little bit in people in the private equity community, and they're all saying that this is going to be tough year for emerging markets. And in fact, this morning I just Googled headwinds and emerging markets. In January, they said that headwinds is becoming tailwinds for emerging markets. But obviously, that's not the case. In the month of July, halfway into 2022, there are plenty of problems and challenges being faced by the world economy, arising from the Ukraine war, the resurgent pandemic, and other issues. But definitely, this is going to impact on emerging markets, including Indonesia. So what we will do today, I will ask Dr. Chatib Basri, one of the smartest economists in Indonesia, and also my good friend Steven Ciobo. Both of them are my good friends, actually. We are both policy bromance people, right? I'm going to ask each one of them to give a 7 to 10 minute take on the issue. And after that, I will ask some questions. And then please ask your questions in the chat box, and I will be able to identify your questions and ask them to the distinguished speakers, right? And by the way, we're very lucky we're getting people who really know the issue. Chatib Basri, again, as I said, he was the chairman of investment committee, minister for finance, and now he's at the Bank Mandiri, president, commissioner, right? And he is really the guy to ask when it comes to the world economy and Indonesian economy. Steven Ciobo, he was Minister for Trade and Investment, Minister for Defense, Minister for Tourism. He has his hands all over the place in government, but now he is doing private work. He's involved with Stonepeak, one of the largest private equity in the United States. Yeah. So with that, Pak Dede, let me ask you for your take. Headwinds, how worried should it be, and how should we respond?
Thank you very much, Dino. Good afternoon for everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here. Very happy to share my view regarding the recent development about I call this situation is a perfect storm, Dino, because it's as a combination of this economic tension and also the geopolitical tension. Yeah, and then this happened at the same time. So let me start by looking at this economic situation. I think all of us already aware of what happened in the U.S. about the tightening cycle through the monetary policy. A week ago, the Fed decided to raise the interest rate by 75 basis points. And I think the inflation pressure is still there, even though some people believe that this should be the peak of the inflation threat in the US. But I think the issue is probably this will take some time before the inflation can be entirely, managed by the Fed. Then the next question is, what will be the implication for the emerging market economy? I can imagine that we are seeing about 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in the US. So officially US in the recession. But one thing that I would like to highlight here, if you look at the contraction in the second quarter of the US economy, was probably less compared to what they had in the first quarter. So somehow I do hope that we will see a sort of like a better or improvement of the signal of the recovery of economy, but we probably have to wait. But the implication, if probably the Fed will need to continue to raise the interest rate another 50 basis points in the next 2 rounds. And this maybe probably will also continue in 2023, maybe by the end of 2023. There is a possibility that they will sort of like, end the tightening cycle. The implication is if US economy is slowing down, this will have an impact to European countries and also China. Yeah, and I'm talking about emerging economies. China play a very important role, especially for a country like Indonesia, like Australia, which produce the natural resources. So nowadays the price of coal is all-time high at this moment, but probably we have to anticipate about a couple of years from now, when the global growth is slowed down, there will be an impact on the energy prices. That's already happened about the commodity prices like the palm oil, for example. So the emerging market needs to anticipate about the possibility of the spillover, the negative spillover, which is probably the slowdown of the economy as well. The other issue that the emerging market needs to anticipate is the tightening cycle, because we are seeing the inflation threat in many countries all over the world, not only in the US, also in Europe. Probably Steve later on can share about the situation in Australia. But even in the case of Indonesia, even though the inflation is still relatively low compared to many emerging markets, it's about 4.9%. But I can see the potential that the inflation is going to go up. And I can imagine that every central bank all over the world except China now try to sort of like to introduce the tightening cycle. Maybe Bank Indonesia will also need to take the tightening cycle by the end of this year or maybe next year. Yeah. So from the economic side, we will see that the possibility of the slowdown of the economy because the tightening monetary cycle. At the same time, many emerging economies are facing a problem due to the geopolitical tension because the increase of the food price. Yeah, and we can see that especially the impact to the vulnerable groups, the increase of the food prices is going to hit the vulnerable groups, including the one in Indonesia, because the increase of the price of grain for wheat, for example, will have an impact on the noodle or other food as well. So from the fiscal side, the government need to allocate more funding, to protect the vulnerable groups in terms of this policy. But so the implication is there will be a sort of like a requirement for the government or the need for the government to implement a sort of like an expansive fiscal policy. But I don't think the emerging economies have the luxury to do it now because the tightening cycle. So the issue is, that's probably one of the big issue that have been and will continue to be discussed in the G20 about how to recalibrate the economic to withdraw, to exit the stimulus from the perspective of developed countries and also the developing economies, because the developing economies need to continue for the fiscal expansion. At the same time, we are seeing sort of like the inflation threat at the developed countries. They need to withdraw the stimulus. So how to recalibrate this issue will become a big issue that we need to discuss in the future. Talking from the Indonesian perspective, I would say that relatively speaking, in comparative perspective, Indonesia stands out, especially in terms of this financial market. And one of the reasons behind it is because we are lucky we run a trade surplus, the current account surplus, thanks to the high commodity prices and also the energy prices. But of course, the question is, this commodity and energy super cycle will end one day. So there is a need to sort of like an anticipation for the government to prepare on that. The second issue, I mentioned about this issue earlier, about how to protect the vulnerable groups, because this geopolitical tension, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, even though this very far from Indonesia, but we already felt the impact through the rising food prices. And especially for the poor people, this will have an impact because the big chunk of their consumption are basically food. So the government need to allocate more funding on this. But the challenge for Indonesia is next year, we will try to consolidate our fiscal. I will make our budget deficit to be less than 3%. So we can imagine at the same time, there is a need to allocate more funding for the vulnerable groups. The government continue to subsidize the fossil fuel, which is later on I can share my view on this. I don't think this would be the right policy to do so under this kind of situation. But because this, the impact of the energy prices, the government decided to give a protection for the vulnerable groups. This will have an impact on the allocation of funding, because a lot of money will be allocated to the subsidy, etc. Then at the same time, the government try to consolidate the fiscal deficit to be less than 3%. Then the question is how the government can allocate the funding, the budget allocation effectively. Because otherwise, if we continue to subsidize all this fossil fuel, etc., then this would happen at the expense of the productive sector. So the implication is, I can see the possibility of the fiscal contraction. At the same time, the monetary tightening will happen soon or probably next year. And the implication is both from the internal and also the external sector, there will be a sort of like strong headwinds for Indonesia and also other emerging economies. So there is a risk of the slowdown. But despite all this situation, I think we can see a sense of this optimism because the currency remains stable thanks to the trade surplus or the current surplus at this moment. And then we also seeing that sort of like a capital inflow still coming into the equity, not in the fixed income market. So overall, that I will call that Indonesia, I hate to use this term, Dino, but Indonesia is probably one of the, I should call that, least unattractive countries in the world. Not because we are doing great, but because other parts of the world are in trouble. So I leave it up here and we will continue in the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to quote you on that later. Steve, Stonepeak invests a lot in emerging countries, of course in the US also. What's your take?
Thank you very much, Dino, for the opportunity to join with you all this afternoon and the chance to reflect on some of the headwinds that are facing emerging markets. I think in order to look at where we're potentially going to go, it's important to understand where we've been. And I might just reflect for a moment on the journey of the past couple of years. Everyone knows, of course, that we've faced significant challenges through COVID. But if you actually look at real GDP in emerging markets, it dropped on average 7.4% in 2020. which represented 10 percentage points below pre-pandemic expectations. And of course, those emerging markets that had a heavy reliance on tourism, those with large services sectors, as a consequence of the lockdowns, as a consequence of border closures, those countries were particularly badly affected in terms of their impact and contraction on GDP. And also, of course, the impact that had on gross debt, on public debt. But what we saw was that the first year of the crisis was certainly harder and higher in emerging markets than it was in advanced economies. And it was largely due to a number of things. As we know, in emerging markets, there's generally lower levels of a lower capacity in terms of the health system, which meant that there was a forced reliance on stricter mobility restrictions and a smaller opportunity for much of the workforce to change to portable teleworking jobs. Work from home, so to speak, was more difficult in a number of emerging economies. So that tended to mean that in low-income countries, that could avoid output decline, mainly due to their younger populations and because they weren't necessarily as adversely affected. More broadly across the group, though, in terms of emerging markets, the decline was more significant than it was in many advanced economies. So what did countries do to respond to that? Well, this is an interesting question because we saw, I think, very positively that in contrast to some of the previous examples where we've seen pandemics, we've seen, for example, SARS, where we've seen MERS, we actually saw this time targeted direct fiscal policy support that really put a floor under the reduction in output that emerging economies faced. And that was able to mitigate some of the worst effects of the pandemic. And it really came through a number of different things. It was investment above the line, so to speak, in terms of health and social, public works, tax breaks, as well as some below the line measures, including, for example, asset purchases by central banks and the assumption of debt by central banks as well, and the guarantees that were put in place. So those were all big positives that really helped to drive and put a floor underneath some of the contraction that we saw in emerging markets. Now, as a consequence of this unprecedented fiscal support that we saw, we also then saw a knock-on effect, which was a significant increase in public debt. And the general level, the median public debt to GDP ratio in emerging markets at the end of last year stood at 60%. And that represents 8 percentage points higher than was, for example, predicted by the IMF. And the reason I mention that, Dino, is because understanding the way the emerging markets really face that level of public debt really is the single biggest, in my view, the single biggest headwind that emerging markets are going to face. Because there's not as much opportunity for them to adjust their fiscal policy on account of the fact that there is such a high level of general public debt. We also saw monetary policy, of course, that is the central bank's decisions around interest rates, start to have an impact. And I mentioned that as well because that picks up on some of the key themes that Pat Basri was speaking about with respect to inflation and what some of the impacts are of inflation. Now, we saw in emerging markets, over 90% of the central banks undertook easing in terms of a reduction of their policy interest rates. And we also saw in many emerging markets, the central banks using widespread and unprecedented use of asset purchasing programs, or as they called it, quantitative easing. So you've got, on the one hand, these high levels of public debt that affect fiscal opportunity. And then you had central banks that swung into action and provided as much support as they could in terms of monetary policy. Now, what we've seen off the back of that monetary policy was that in many respects, the pump was really primed. And we've seen now this wave of inflation moving across the global economy. Now, it's not affecting every market. You get, for example, China, which is not experiencing the same inflationary effects that Europe is, or that the United States is, or that Australia is, for example. But where countries have low levels of unemployment, a strongly stimulated economy, and high energy input costs in particular, then they're really feeling the crunch that comes from that higher inflation. And there can be no doubt that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could not, frankly, have come at a worse time. The impact that that's had in terms of a big spike in prices around energy inputs, the general level of geopolitical uncertainty is also fueling this issue. We're seeing, of course, in the last 24 hours, additional geopolitical uncertainty in our own part of the world, in particular in the South China Sea. All of these factors are causing significant headwinds, not only for emerging markets, but indeed for the whole global economy, because you've got higher input costs, especially around energy. You've got governments trying to take policy decisions around what they're going to do on energy security. You've got heavily indebted public balance sheets, which means that governments don't have as much flexibility as they ordinarily would have with respect to their fiscal policy decisions. And you've now got central banks in most economies ramping up interest rates to try to curb the inflation dragon. So there are, on any measure, a number of very significant economic headwinds that emerging markets, but indeed more broadly advanced economies as well, are required to face. And that's going to present some really significant challenges. And then, of course, you've got the overlay, which is that we're still actually not finished with this COVID pandemic. We're seeing fourth and fifth waves. We're seeing continued variants. We had initial great success, of course, with the vaccines, but now the variants have moved so far that the vaccines aren't as effective as they were at preventing illness or indeed serious disease. So, you know, it is just a really challenging time, especially in emerging markets.
Thank you, Steve. You know, IMF, as you know, has warned of a possible global recession this year or next year. And a lot of people are talking about the fear of possible stagflation hitting the world. What's your take on this? Basri first, and then Steve.
Well, the possibility, of course, the possibility is there. If you let me quote a statement by Larry Summers, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, when he gave a talk at the London School of Economics. He mentioned that the US economy definitely needs a recession to defeat the inflation. And he even mentioned that there is a need probably about the unemployment more than 5% in the next 5 years. He mentioned specifically 6% unemployment for the next 5 years, or 7.5% in the next 2 years, unemployment of 7.5%, or 10% unemployment for 1 year in order to address the issue of this inflation. Of course, this will definitely have an impact if the US economy, as I mentioned to you earlier, slow down, is going to hit the the European countries, the EU, the emerging economies, including China as well. So once China gets hit, because 60% of our export is energy and commodity related, then Indonesia, you know, will face the sort of like an issue, the slowing down of this our export as well. So the possibility is there. But one thing that I would like to raise, Dino, that if you look at the contraction of the US economy in the second quarter was relatively less compared to what they had in the first quarter. So there is a possibility that, you know, maybe in the third quarter, then the US economy will recover. So hopefully it's too early to conclude that the US economy the recession will continue. Officially, they are in a recession. And if you look at the consumption data, remain relatively strong in the US. Yeah, but I agree with you. I think emerging economies need to anticipate what we can do. Yeah, as if there is a problem on the external sector, then the solution should be the internal. But unfortunately, our hands are also tied because not much room for the fiscal in the emerging market. Yeah, and also the tightening monetary cycle. So I think, like it or not, probably the implication is we will see the sort of like the slowdown on the emerging economies as well. But I would say that the impact will probably relatively not as bad as what we had back on 2013 during the taper tantrum.
Okay, and by the way, the U.S. Government also says the labor market, despite the two consecutive contractions, remain well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're not in a state of panic. Yeah. Steve, what's your take? Yeah.
Look, stagflation is a very real risk. There's no doubt about it. And some economic commentators say that we will have a stagflation period. Others say the jury's still out. I mean, it's hard to predict. What we do know is that we haven't faced this kind of economic circumstance, Dino, for decades. For so long, China was exporting deflation to the world. Now we face a situation where we have largely, not solely because of energy, but because energy is such a significant input cost and there's so many constraints on energy, we are seeing that inflation is a problem. And you've got very, very low levels of unemployment. And so there isn't that capacity in the labour market to be able to absorb the stimulus that was there. So this stimulus that was driven by the quantitative easing that was put in place, as well as the fiscal, initiatives that were undertaken by governments globally, we're now seeing that bite because we saw unemployment levels really tracking down for the last 2 years. And this, again, these are broad generalizations, but we saw this as general themes around the world. Unemployment tracking down, fiscal stimulus, monetary policy stimulus as there was quantitative easing put in place, and there was just this massive build-up in demand. Then you had the problems around supply chain. You had closures all across China, which is, as we all know, for most countries, their largest trade partner. So we had supply chain issues in terms of impacts on inflation, and then you've got the energy impacts on inflation as well. So we potentially do run a very real risk of having a high inflationary, low growth period, because as interest rates keep going up, it is going to taper demand. I mean, to talk about Australia, for example, people that know Australia know that this is a nation that is obsessed with housing and obsessed with house prices. There's a joke that if you go to Sydney, it only takes about a minute for someone in Sydney to start talking to you about house prices. So that is a very quintessentially part of being Australian. But the Reserve Bank in Australia now for 3 consecutive months has put interest rates up, and at pretty significant rates, and certainly much more quickly than even the Reserve Bank themselves anticipated only a matter of 6 or 12 months ago. So the impact of that on house prices in Australia is being felt. It is stymieing demand. It's certainly stymieing disposable income for the third of people that are mortgaged and are having to repay those mortgages. For emerging markets, stagflation differs country by country. As I said, China's not got the inflation problems that we're seeing in other countries. But the fact that we're seeing core inflation really tick up is concerning. And we're going to have to just walk this very fine line between providing the support that economies are still needing, because you could easily see another wave of COVID infections or something like that. So there still needs to be support, but there also needs to be some constraints on that demand to take some of the heat out of the economies and hopefully pull inflation down. And the best way to do that as well at the moment, of course, is to provide more energy security, and that's even tough in a carbon emissions constrained world. So you've got all these factors that are feeding in. It's a real challenge.
Well, I want to pick up from that, Steve. At the end of last year, everybody's gung ho about the green transformation and net zero world and so on. The political momentum is there, diplomatic momentum is there, certainly economic momentum. Over 1,000 big companies in the UN sign a pledge towards net zero. And I'm just wondering, with all these problems that we have, the possible global recession, high energy and commodity price, possible stagflation and all that, is this gonna detract from that net zero movement in emerging countries? And I would like to get Basri's view on this as well. But you first, Steve.
Look, it certainly makes it more challenging, Dino. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you know, in any democracy, and Indonesia, of course, is you know, one of the biggest democracies in the world. In any democracy, it is a real challenge about how you can achieve the kinds of goals you want to achieve on, you know, reaching net zero, but doing so in a way that doesn't force prices up and the cost of energy up. And that is a real balancing act for politicians, whether it's Indonesia, the United States, Australia, or Europe. You know, the community certainly has expectations that governments will take decisive action to help mitigate the impact of climate change, but they also don't want to see energy prices skyrocket. Now, fortunately, we are seeing, you know, real advances in terms of renewables. You know, Stonepeak as a business is very heavily committed to renewables, is very heavily committed to the UN principles for responsible investing, very heavily committed to ESG considerations. And of course, those that invest money with us have high expectations in that. So we're doing all that we can to help transition the world to a carbon constrained future. But we also need, and governments need to be very aware of what is the transition going to look like, because we can't just turn off, for example, coal-fired power stations overnight. We can't just turn off, you know, some of the high emitting, unfortunately, industries, because if we did that, the impact would be significant in terms of a spike in prices. And so it's how governments navigate the tough challenges over the next 3, 5, 7 years that are going to be decisive in terms of whether they do it successfully or whether they don't.
Okay. Pak Dede, Chatib Basri.
Yeah, of course, you know, this situation will make of this goal to achieve this net zero emission or the green economy will not be easier. Yeah, as you said, because the geopolitical tension in Russia and Ukraine definitely complicates the energy transition. So, for example, like even some European countries now started to ask coal from countries like Indonesia. Yeah, so we can see sort of like, you know, the process is not going to be easy. The other issue is some investment on technology that in the past was probably feasible because the relatively low interest rate, but with the tightening cycle, now the cost of fund will become more expensive. Somehow this will have an impact to the process of our goal in achieving this net zero emission. Financing is also become a big issue. But on the other hand, I would like to say that this is an opportunity for us. Why? Because when the fossil fuel price is very expensive, there is an incentive actually for many countries to shift into renewable energy. Yeah, with the oil price is almost $100, now renewable energy become feasible. Because if the oil price is relatively low, then there is no incentive for the people to go into that direction. Yeah, but let me be frank and honest with you, Dino. Unfortunately, sort of like a policy like Indonesia's doing now by keep the fuel subsidy on place probably will not be the right decision to do in terms of this encouraging the renewable energy, because the first step that probably the government needs to do if they want to shift into the renewable energy net zero emission, they probably need to adjust the fuel price and then use this money to protect the vulnerable groups, like for the cash transfer, like what we did back on 2005, 2008, 2013, for example. But of course, I do understand this is not politically easy at this moment. So in short, I would say that, of course, the current situation will have this impact, a negative impact of this, our trajectory path. But at the same time, I'm also see the opportunities that we can take from this, because the high energy prices will shift the demand into renewable energy.
You know, the response for some countries, including emerging markets in difficult times, would be more protectionism. Right? And in fact, during the early years of pandemic, that was the response almost all of us, you know, the closed border and, you know, it's me first and so on. Yeah. I'm just wondering what will be the response this time? Will there be more temptation for protectionist policies? Chatib Basri.
Yeah, what I'm afraid my answer is yes, because it's already happening. And my biggest concern nowadays is look at what happened on this food security, for example. More than 60 countries, well, Steve knows better than I do because he's a former Minister of Trade. More than 60 countries already imposed the export restriction on food. And we badly need the global cooperation at this moment, but what most of the countries are doing are basically sort of like exactly what you said, Dino, me first. So we are in the situation like in the prisoner's dilemma. We do understand that long-term cooperation will be the best payoff, but we prefer to focus just for the short term. And I can see under this kind of situation, every country will focus for their own, you know, to fulfill their own needs, like in the issue of the food security. That's also happened during the pandemic with the case of vaccine. So I can see the pressure of this protectionism is there. Under this kind of situation, then there is no incentive for country to do the unilateral reform. Yeah, the WTO, even though I'm a big fan of this multilateral approach, but the prospect is still uncertain. Unilateral reform is also in a difficult situation. So probably the most feasible solution under this kind of situation is like the regional arrangement or the open regionalism. That's the best that we can have. Yeah, but I can see the tendency of the pressure of this trade protectionism will increase under this kind of situation.
Steve, the problem is not just protectionism, isn't it? It's protectionism plus populism plus nationalism, right? How do you see this? Yeah, and do you see this in Australia as well? Yeah.
Dino, I'm trying to find some positive things we can talk about. Look, I'll address that question, but just to pick up on some of the points that Pak Basri raised, I could not agree more. You know, I think everything he said is entirely true, and you know, it concerns me because this decoupling that we're seeing, this fragmentation of the global economy, guess what? The world has done that before. This is not new. It's the pendulum swings, and we all know what happens when we decouple economies and we fragment the global economy, when we adopt a me-first approach. The only thing that flows from that is countries and people become poorer, they have less choice, and they have bigger economic problems in the future. So, you know, there are unfortunately snake oil salesmen, as we call them, snake oil salesmen that are out there preaching that what we need to do is put up borders, we need to close our economies, we need to, you know, shift from offshore to bringing everything onshore. That is, you know, it sounds tempting, and there's a market for that message, but that is nothing other than a pathway to a poorer, less, you know, what's what I'm after, less choice in the market than we have now. The world had 40, 50 years of opening up, and we're all better off for it. If we now turn our backs on that and go in the opposite direction, we will all be poorer as a consequence of that choice. So, you know, that is something that also concerns me. But look, there are bright lights too. So I want to focus on some of the positives. Yes, we are seeing that this is a time of populism. Yes, we're seeing it's a time of protectionism. But you know what? There are also examples of where some of the excesses have been rejected. We've seen election outcomes where some of the more extreme positions that have been adopted on policy have been rejected. And that's, you know, that thankfully is a very good outcome. But ultimately, I think this is going to be relatively straightforward, right? Those countries that adopt more protectionism, well, guess what? One of the most protected economies in the world is North Korea. So they're going to go down the path of becoming more like North Korea. And I know that sounds extreme, but my point is simply, if you take it to the extreme example, that's the path they're walking down of protectionism. Those that continue to engage that on all measures, whether it's services economy, whether it's trade and goods, those are the economies that will prosper into the future as well. And one final really positive thought, Dino. We developed, when I say we, the world developed in record time a very effective vaccine against COVID. Why did that happen? It happened for one reason, and that was global efforts around the world, people coming together, sharing knowledge, working together, capital flowing across all the markets. That's the reason we were able to respond so comprehensively and quickly to one of the most significant challenges the world has faced basically since World War II.
Thank you for that, Steve, and thank you for reminding us on the need to be always positive minded. And this brings to my question to Chatib Basri. You were Minister of Finance and you handled G20. I think you were a Sherpa also for G20. Yeah. So by the way, for those students who are listening and don't know, Sherpa is not a dog. Sherpa is the guy who handles. Sherpa is also a dog, but in the G20 context, somebody who handles policies, right? But following what Steve said, yes, we need more global cooperation, but now we are facing a divided world where the mode of interaction is marked by confrontation and rivalry and even mistrust. Yeah, and we're seeing this then in the G20, how G20 is really having a hard time because of the divisions between G7 and Russia and maybe some other countries. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, how do you see this, Basri, at a time when we need cooperation most globally to resolve economic and other global challenges? But at the same time, cooperation, the world is divided and multilateralism is affected by it, and other mechanisms of cooperation that we usually rely on are also affected by it. So how do we get out of this? Yeah.
This is
knowing that the Ukraine war will still happen for quite some time. Yeah.
This is a very important question and tough question as well, Dino. As we know that Indonesia, as the Indonesia presidency for the G20, we are in a very difficult situation now because this, the divide between the G7 and other countries as well. But let me take what Steve said. Yeah, under this kind of situation, we have to work within constraint. Yeah, and Steve mentioned about how the global cooperation was possible in the case of vaccine, because we had a common enemy at that time, the common platform. Yeah, and I recall during the G20, if you recall, back on 2008, the first leaders meeting in Washington at the time. Yeah, one of the reasons why the G20 can act swiftly at the time because we had a common problem, the global financial crisis. So I can from this perspective, my suggestion is maybe Indonesia or the G20 countries have to think about to select or some of the issues that universally shared by every member. So I do understand there will be a sort of like a tension during the G20 meeting, but some of the issues that universally share, for example, like the issue of this food crisis, I believe that all the countries, felt the hit because of this issue. You're talking about the issue of health. Every country are facing a similar situation related to that. So this remind me with the situation back on 2014, when we had the G20 meeting in in St. Petersburg leaders meeting at the time, and Indonesia proposed to talk about this high-level summit for food because the increase of the and also the Syria, if I'm not mistaken. So if we can find a sort of like issue that can be universally shared, I think there is a possibility that we can work together, exactly like Steve said, when we had to work together regarding the issue of vaccine, and we can cooperate. But once we start to talk about this tension between the interests of the G7 and others, definitely we cannot come to the agreement.
Well, I understand U.S. is technically recession, as Basri says, 2 times contraction of Q1 and Q2. China is slowing down, and some other countries are economically depressed. I want to ask Steve this question. What about the idea of emerging markets relying on each other for their economic growth? I know Indonesia and Australia, we established a MICTA, for example, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, Korea, and Australia. Yes, right. I don't know what's happened to that, but that seemed like a good way to get emerging markets or middle powers to enhance their economic, if not political, cooperation. But why is it so difficult for emerging markets to come together and do more?
Well, I think, there certainly is that potential, Dino. I think one of the key factors, though, for emerging markets is that there are actually often better complementarities that flow from deals done with advanced economies. When I was doing the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or IHEPA as we called it, we at its core were very strong complementarities between Australia and Indonesia that we knew would provide the win-win outcome that we're looking for. Now, there is some good news. You look at, for example, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP as it's called. Now, that's a big positive. That's a good trade deal. Now, I would argue it's not as ambitious as it should be, but you know what? It provides some good gains. It provides some enhanced market access, and that's a positive thing. Of course, you've got the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. It would be great, for example, for Indonesia to look at joining CPTPP. The UK is looking at joining CPTPP. So these are important trade investment deals that, put rules of the road down around the trade in goods and services, as well as the movement of people. And that's a big positive. So to answer your question, I think that work can be done. ASEAN, of course, plays a key role in driving a lot of these initiatives. But alongside ASEAN, there just needs to be, a doubling down of effort to try to continue to drive good economic outcomes on trade investment, because investment flows are going to be critical. But for the reasons there's some more good news. Take, for example, just want to focus on some of the positives. The G7 recently announced this new infrastructure initiative. Now, we haven't yet seen much meat on those bones other than the announcement. But there is a recognition that the advanced economies of the world, the G7 in particular, need to drive more investment in infrastructure, need to share more knowledge, more intellectual property with emerging markets to help drive a greater take-up and rollout of infrastructure around the world. Now, that's going to be pro-growth. It's going to be helpful in terms of reducing inflation over time. So there are some real positives that will flow from that. Getting that foreign direct investment, getting that flow of capital going between countries, opening up new sectors, that's all critical. Indonesia, again, to focus on Indonesia, has had just such tremendous success at growing the digital economy side of the country. It really is going to be a source of strength for Indonesia into the future. But we need to drive more of those initiatives all throughout Asia, as well as more broadly through emerging markets.
Thank you. Before I read some questions from the audience, I want to ask Basri this question, a tricky question. You mentioned that the government will need to make hard decisions, especially regarding fuel subsidies, and yes, it's politically difficult, but it is probably going to be necessary to undertake given the economic situation. So my question is, President Jokowi is definitely not running again in 2024. This is his last term, right? So doesn't that mean that it is safe for him to make that political decision to reduce fuel subsidies, because he's not running for president again, right, in 2024? Yeah. So what's your take on this? And feel free if you don't want to answer this, if it's too sensitive. Yeah.
This is a very tough question. I fully agree with you, Dino, but I think we probably should look at this issue from the election 2024 perspective as well. While it is true that President Jokowi will not run again in 2024, this will be his last term. Yeah, but don't forget that most of the political parties will have their own candidate in 2024. They probably will not support this kind of policy, yeah, because it's probably unpopular. Or if President Jokowi has his own candidate, that probably could risk will have a negative impact on his own candidate as well. So I think we probably have to look at this issue more on the perspective of 2024. But let me put this way, yeah. Even from the political perspective, I should say that if the government reduce the fuel subsidy and use the money to protect the vulnerable groups, it's still politically sound, because the one who take the advantage of this fuel subsidy is basically middle and upper class. They consume gasoline 6 times higher than the lower middle income group. So the most important thing is the narrative, rather than talking the fuel price adjustment, but the narrative should be how to protect the vulnerable groups under this geopolitical tension by providing the direct cash transfer for the poor people, and we redirect this money from the subsidy from middle and upper income group to the lower middle income group. That kind of narrative is needed, I think.
Okay, so let me take some questions. One is from Leah Hun from Singapore. Question is to any of the speakers. What do you think about green economy as an opportunity for emerging markets to develop a more resilient bounce from the global economy uncertainty? Anyone, Steve or Chatib Basri?
Oh, okay, let me start then. I do believe that this is something that we should take it seriously, yeah, about the green economy. And some of the studies have been conducted by the World Bank shows that the multiplier effect of this green economy is even larger. Yeah, so I can imagine, for example, I was mentioning about this reduction of the fuel subsidy. The important question is there such thing as policy that could protect the vulnerable groups, good for macro and also good for green? And the answer is reduction of the fuel subsidy, because it will reduce the demand for fossil fuel. You give the money to the poor people and will provide the room sort of like, for your fiscal situation. So under this kind of situation, I do believe that green economy is one of the potential, and the implication, the multiplier is there. But Steve raised this issue, and I fully agree with him. The most important thing is not about the new equilibrium, but the transition. Yeah, because we are facing the transitional risk. So how to make sure that when we go to the net zero emission, we move to the new equilibrium, how this process can be affordable, because otherwise it will be very difficult, especially for the resource-rich countries, to transform themselves into the green economy.
Okay, Steve, you want to jump in, or I can ask you a different question?
No, let's get through some questions. I largely agree with what.
Okay. Esther asks, from Indonesia. In 2021, the G7 and G20 endorsed a global aim to relocate at least $100 billion of SDRs from IMF to poorer countries, but the pledge remains unfulfilled. What's your take on this?
I don't profess to have any expertise on that, Dino, so I'm going to pass. I don't know if Pak Basri has a view on it.
Yeah, let me try to respond to this. It is true, Dino, but there are some of the issues that was being discussed during the G20 meeting in Bali and also in Jakarta in the last two finance minister and central bank governors meeting about the so-called common framework, yeah, in order to address this issue. The tension is how can we implement this common framework about this, to address the issue of the
More
debt.
questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Please go ahead, please.
Yeah, the debt distress, whether we have to do it case by case or is across the board. And this is related to the reason why this issue is being discussed, because the amount of the resources is also limited. Yeah, so that is why, if you recall, there was a statement from Secretary Yellen about a couple months ago that even Bretton Woods institution need to be reformed, because Bretton Woods was not designed for the multifaceted crisis, energy crisis, geopolitical crisis, and the health crisis, etc. Yeah, so I think this issue we probably will be discussed again during the next finance minister and central bank governor meeting.
Okay. There is a question from Joko from Brawijaya University to any of the speakers. How do you think that the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and other regional arrangements can help emerging markets to face this economic uncertainty?
Well, I think that there's strong potential, like any good trade deal, trade investment, I should say trade and investment deal. If you reduce friction in trade, whether that's around alignment on rules, or whether that's because you reduce taxes that affect exports and imports, which of course are tariffs, or whether it's because you make it easier for people to be able to travel from one country to the other, to be able to work, provide services in other countries. Each of those things boosts national income. And that's a big positive for countries. In addition to that, you tend to get some positive externalities, so to speak. The positive externalities that flow from that are higher levels of consumer confidence, more consumer choice, and of course you get a more efficient allocation of capital. So those are all the positives that flow. In particular, though, for RCEP, for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the fact that it is, for all intents and purposes, Asia-focused, is a big positive as well. And it's seen countries be able to, drive investment and drive trade facilitation between them in the region. And, that's been constrained by COVID, but I think we'll see the positive benefits that flow from that over the coming years.
Can I jump in?
Please.
I would like to add from the geopolitical perspective, because I think the RCEP is very strategic. Yeah, most of the ASEAN countries, we are in a very difficult situation between the tension between US and China, and I think the RCEP will play a very important role, because I'm not a diplomat. I'm no longer in the government, so I can speak freely. I don't think there will be an easy to deal with China on the bilateral basis. So if we want to negotiate with the big elephant in the rooms, like China and the US, we should prepare ourselves as a one entity. So ASEAN as an entity is a very important strategy. So when we deal with China, it's not Indonesia with China or Singapore with China, but ASEAN plus, ASEAN with China, ASEAN with Japan and Korea, So I think from this perspective, the RCEP is very important to sort of like to make sure that ASEAN can still play a role, under this kind of tension between US and China. And I think this just want to add what Steve said from the geopolitical perspective. This is very strategic, and I do understand. Perhaps you involved on this idea as well. We started to raise this idea probably back in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, when Indonesia was chair of ASEAN summit at the time.
Okay, and also want to remind all the politicians in the DPR who might be listening to this, you need to ratify RCEP, okay? Please, we are one of the remaining very few countries who have not ratified RCEP. So I'm paying your salary, I'm paying through my tax, so you better do this soon, okay? We have a question from Andy from Surabaya. What is the impact of the current US-China strategic tension with regard to Pelosi's visit economically? So what do you think would be the economic impact? None, or it will be something? Any one of you?
Well, I mean, to answer that direct question, it's probably too early to tell. It's only been in the last 24 hours. I think we need to see how this plays out over the next 3 or 4 days in particular. The announcement by China today of the 6 zones where they'd be undertaking live fire exercises and military exercises. We need to see how that actually plays out. I saw today Taiwan said that it was, from their perspective, effectively a blockade of air and sea. So we just need to see how this plays out. I mean, there is potential for this to be quite a negative economic event, and for there to be very negative sentiment around what's happening. If cool heads prevail, well, then hopefully this issue will move forward and there will be no sort of long-term impacts or effects off the back of it. But it's just too early to tell what the impact is off the back of the speaker's visit to Taiwan.
Yeah, but Steve, China has officially warned that if the visit takes place, that would be a red line, and I think the wording was it would be very serious and so on, and dangerous, right? So from China's perspective, they would also want to show that, hey, when we gave a warning and then it happened, we're gonna prove that we were serious, right? Wouldn't that be that factor as well? Yeah.
Look, absolutely. But I mean, this, unfortunately, the rhetoric on both sides was allowed to get higher and higher and higher. I think China overplayed their hand in terms of saying there'd be such dire, consequences if something happened. And then, of course, that meant that the US was sort of in a corner where they couldn't back down and the speaker not go. I mean, it wasn't a very well handled situation. But look, having said that, what matters now is the way countries react. I think you're absolutely right, Dino. I mean, everyone will be watching China. The ball is now in China's court as to how they react and respond to this. As I said, if cool heads prevail, that will be the best outcome for the world. And I'm not just saying that in terms of the potential for kinetic conflict or armed conflict. I'm saying that even economically. China, I saw, has made announcements today around the exportation of, I think it was sand to Taiwan. There will obviously be some economic impacts, but the last thing the world needs at a time when we've got COVID, at a time when we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is now have another massive challenge because, for example, the US and China are, sort of engaged in retaliatory tactics with each other. That will just be more very significant bad news. And so we hope that that's not where it goes.
Basri, do you think Asian countries will turn their heads away from this tension and reluctant to say anything? Because so far I haven't heard much from Asian governments. Or do you think they're gonna say something? Yeah.
Well, we are in a very difficult situation because we cannot choose between US and China, right? Because from the economic perspective, like it or not, China presence is inevitable. Yeah, China is our major trading partner. Our means Southeast Asia countries, yeah, is very vital, very important. But at the same time, we also do understand that we need to maintain the geopolitical balance related to that. So that is why I mentioned to you about this RCEP is a very important, it's very strategic position under this kind of situation.
Okay, spoken like a true diplomat, Basri. Question from Chris. I think this is addressed to Steve, being from the private sector. From your point of view, how can you see the private sector to be substantially contribute to the emerging markets economy? Since, as you may know, the private sector is really one of the most reliable actors that can help emerging markets on the current condition. Steve?
Well, the private sector can play a very important role because, you know, there's a lot of capital that needs to be put to work all around the world. And that capital can be invested to drive economies to help promote growth. I spoke about infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure is, for many emerging markets, probably one of the areas where governments could fairly inexpensively develop policy that will help to crowd in, that is, to promote more private sector investment in infrastructure. Now, whether that's as part of the energy transition, whether that's as part of the approach to renewables, or whether that's in some of the traditional sectors, like, for example, ports and roads, rail, bridges, those types of things, as well as a whole range of new sectors, including, for example, data centers. And look at the great work that Indonesia's done, as I said, around the digital economy. These are all sectors with the opportunity for government to put policies in place that will crowd in private sector investment, that will promote economic growth, that will create employment, and that will have positive benefits for emerging markets, but indeed for everybody into the future. So I think the private sector can play a very big role. The number one reason why private sector doesn't invest is because of risk. So it's really important that the policy settings are right. It's really important that governments recognise that they need to mitigate risk, that they can't have a situation where their policies or their monopolies, for example, if they've got monopoly service providers or monopoly customers because they're large government entities, for example, if that's part of the economic landscape in a country, more often than not, the private sector will not invest because there's just too much risk. And this is where policy settings are really important.
Steve, just follow-up question to that. I know ESG is very important to a lot of investors, yeah, environmental, social, and governance in your investment decisions. Do you find in emerging economies that some don't appreciate the importance of ESG enough for them to implement in their economic reform in order to invite more investments? Yeah.
Look, I actually think it's pretty positive, Dino. We're seeing considerations around ESG now fairly coordinated. You know, I think between the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, ASEAN, there's a number of these multilateral organisations that are promoting knowledge sharing. And here's more good news. I mean, if you go back to some of the various serious economic challenges that Asia faced, in particular around currency devaluation as part of you know, what took place a number of years ago, we saw a number of what I would describe as poorly targeted policy responses. Then you fast forward to the last 2 years, where the level of knowledge and the capacity of the public sector, of governments, of departments to respond in a really positive way. Honestly, it's chalk and cheese. It's like night and day. The contrast is so bright. And that's a great sign because it shows that the capacity building, the knowledge, in the public sector is growing. And as I said, you've got organizations like the World Bank, IMF, OECD, for example, which are sharing a lot of this knowledge, and ultimately we are all better off for it. So I actually think it's a big positive.
Okay, that's good to hear. This is a question from Jonathan to Chatib Basri. If the world is supposed to experience a crisis this year or next year, what is the main difference between this year's global economic crisis than the one that occurred in 2008?
Well, I have to say this is rather different because the source of the issue, in 2008, for example, during the global financial crisis, what we saw was sort of like simply the financial sector issues, the over leverage, etc. But at this time is a combination. I call it as a perfect storm, because there is a problem on the supply side, the supply disruption, the energy hikes, the food price hikes, also because the geopolitical tension. At the same time, on the demand side, because the reopening of the economy, the pent-up demand, there is a pressure of the inflation. So I think this issue is also difficult. I'm not saying that this current situation is more difficult than like what we had back on 2008, but I think if you look at from the source of issue, is very different. But I am quite optimistic that at the end of the day that the Fed will be able to address this issue, and then every central banks all over the world will be have this capability to manage the situation. But there is a cost of it. The slowdown of the economy for maybe, I don't know, 1 or 2 years in the 1 or 2 years, and also the impact for the emerging market is the impact to the vulnerable groups. This is the thing that we probably need to anticipate.
If I can follow up, you will remember, I think in 2008, Indonesia escaped from the financial crisis relatively well, relative to others. I think our economy grew by 4%,
Correct.
While others contracted or at 0. But you think the current global economic downturn, I take it from you that Indonesia's economy will still be relatively well off. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I would say, Dino, this is not because we are doing great, but because we are lucky in the sense that we are less integrated to the global economy. So when there is a hit in the global economy, the negative spillover will be relatively less compared to countries like Australia, for example, or Singapore. They're really part of the production network. So if you look at the negative impact, the impact will probably relatively less. Similar situation during the COVID. We had the contraction was around -2%, less compared to Australia because we are less integrated to the global economy. But the implication is when the global economy recover, we are lag behind. Singapore grew by more than 7, 8, similar to Australia, but Indonesian economy only grew by about 4%. So somehow, if you want to sort of like mitigate the negative spillover, we are lucky because we are less integrated, but when the recovery comes, we probably lag behind. So I would say that if the way we address this issue is a combination of 2 things, good policy response and good luck.
I like that. Okay, this is a question from Nicholas in the Philippines. I think this is addressed to Steve. We see that the WTO pinpoints lower trade barriers as the key for economy to develop. However, economic restriction has been implemented by several emerging markets due to the economic uncertainty. How do you see the emerging markets can balance these 2 conditions?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. My answer would actually be it comes down to political leadership. I think strong political leaders who have a clear-eyed sense of what they're trying to achieve for their countries can put forward the arguments that are required about why liberalised trade, liberalised investment is actually a positive thing. But look, that's one of those statements, Dina, that's easy to say. It rolls off the tongue. It sounds great. And of course, the reality is that if you're facing re-election, it's a much tougher challenge because many people are deeply suspicious of trade deals and liberalised investment. So what else do you do? Well, I think you need to point to examples of where it's been a success. There's so many examples of where countries have been able to drive economic growth, have been able to lower employment, have been able to provide greater consumer choice. And they've done that because they pursued trade deals and investment deals. Where that's not the case, you can look at lots of examples of countries where, because they put in place protectionism, it's actually led to less consumer choice and more expensive prices. Really, I just think there's so much data and so much factual information out there now about all of this that it's pretty hard for anyone to argue that protectionism is the way forward. It just generally comes down to political sentiment, and that requires good political leaders.
Okay, I'm going to take the last question. And by the way, I want each one of you to end with what do you think would be something that would make us optimistic and positive in the coming year. Yeah, Steven has said that we need to remain positive. So I want to ask both of you that at the end. Yeah, but first question from Jason Ha from Singapore. How severe is the Fed's decision in raising interest rates to the emerging markets? And from your recommendation, how can the emerging markets respond to such issue? Can you provide us with some examples so that we can understand this better?
You want me to start first?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I think if we look at the tightening cycle at this moment, I do believe that the Fed will continue to raise interest rate until they are sure that they can manage the issue of disinflation. Yeah, the implication is for emerging economies. Most of the central banks all over the world will follow suit. Yeah, including Singapore, including Indonesia later on. And this will have the contractionary impact to the economy. You can imagine if you raise the interest rate, it's going to hit your investment. Yeah, so I think it is inevitable that we will see a sort of like a slowdown of the economy. But I would say this is temporary, because once the central banks are able to address this inflation pressure, they will start to sort of like reduce the tightening cycle, and the economy will start to move again. So this is just something that temporary.
Steve, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say I agree with Pak Basri, we're in a tightening cycle. That's going to present challenges. One of the biggest impacts, of course, is the strong US dollar. We're seeing, the US dollar, I mean, the US has always had an official policy of a strong US dollar, but it hasn't always necessarily been the case. But at the moment, we are seeing a very strong US dollar. If you have a more complicated geopolitical environment going forward, then you could potentially see the flight of capital from emerging markets into more secure markets like the US, and that's a problem as well. So, you unfortunately get these, double layers, triple layers of challenges, because you've got a strong dollar that drives higher inflation in economies with, in relative terms, a declining local currency. If you get that capital that flows from emerging markets back to the United States, that's a challenge as well. I mean, these things are all problematic. It's just got to remain the case that governments need to stay focused on what they can do to drive investment and to drive economic growth. And if they do that, then, and if they take into account their sovereign risk profile, they can put in place effective policy that will promote growth. And that's a positive thing for them. If they fail at doing that, well then, on any measure in relative terms, the standard of living of people in that country goes backwards. And that's just the reality of the way the economy works.
Okay. Well, last question from me is, look, in 2019, at the end of 2019, if you ask any economist, what's the biggest risk that you see for the following year? I don't think anyone will mention the pandemic, right? They mention all social things, but the pandemic. And if you ask last year, what would be the biggest risk for the world economy? I think very, very few would mention the Ukraine war, right? And they would mention all other things. So now, Steve and Basri, if I were to put a gun to your head, right, and ask you, hey, what's going to be the biggest risk next year that may not seem so obvious today, what would be your answer?
You want to start first,
Yes,
Steve?
please.
Okay. To me, Dino, inflation, but I would wait more on the geopolitical issue now, because inflation is something that manageable, but geopolitical issue, we never know. This is something that's very difficult.
You think US-Russia war or US-China war is possible?
Well, I don't know, you know better than I do, but looking from the economic impact for this tension is already bad. So I would imagine that if this tension will continue, this will have a very negative impact on many emerging economies.
Steve, what's your answer next year? So I know where I put my money.
Look, I mean, unfortunately, I agree. I don't know if there's any surprise. I mean, by definition, surprises are unexpected, right? So it's hard to say, but certainly if you look forward over the next 12 or 24 months, there can be no doubt that the geopolitical is a challenge, and there can be no doubt that stagflation and inflation more broadly is a challenge. The good news is that I think that all of these things can be overcome. More good news is that the world has actually been in a tougher geopolitical environment historically. You look at the period of the Cold War, for example, things got very, very tough. We're not in a new Cold War, it's different, but all my point is to say that good political leadership can navigate through these kinds of challenges. And, for the entire global population, we are more reliant now than we have been for quite some time on good political leadership. If we have good political leadership, the world will emerge in 12 or 24 months' time, stronger, more economically robust, with richer people. If we have poor political leadership, we will emerge poorer, will emerge, probably less healthy, and possibly in conflict. So, they're the paths that face every country. It's the same issues, and it just requires people to exercise their judgment at the ballot box if they live in a democracy. If they don't live in a democracy, well, we just hope that common sense prevails.
Steve, forgive me for being unfair to you. To follow up with a question, you're Minister of Defense of Australia. Do you think both Putin and Biden understand that no matter how things unravel in Ukraine, there cannot be war between the US and Russia? Or do you think this is more appreciated by Washington than by Moscow?
So one quick thing, I was defense industry, not defense, but obviously worked closely with the defense minister. But to your question, Dino, honestly, where I sit now, I'm less concerned about US and Russia. One thing that's become clearer over the past 4 months or so is that Russia's effectiveness is not nearly as high as not only I think most of the world thought, but certainly not as high as I think the Russians themselves thought. We're seeing real fatigue among their forces. We're seeing a heavily depleted, tactical force or deployed force that Russia has. So I think that that's probably less likely to be a problem. The area that I am concerned about, of course, is in our own part of the world, in Asia, and in particular around the South China Sea. But the good news is that historically, the US and China have been able to navigate their way through these challenges. And if they continue to do so, as I said, and if there's a recalibration, a focus on multilateralism, those are all positive things. I don't think China's all in the wrong here, and I don't think the US is all in the right. There is a recalibration required as China has continued to grow. But that said, Western countries, Australia, Canada, US, UK, other Western democracies, are also making it clear that the values of democracy are values that they really want to reinforce over autocracies. And we'll see how that plays out.
Okay. Pak Chatib Basri, your final thoughts on, as a positive note, what makes you feel optimistic despite the gloomier prediction on the world economy? And then Steve, you have the last word on that.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've been overlooked is the effort that been made by the global leaders to improve the global economic situation and also the concern to the vulnerable groups. Yeah, one thing that we learned post-pandemic, the fiscal policy will be more inclusive. I think very similar to many countries all over the world, because they are concerned about this vulnerable group. And then don't forget the G20, despite all this difficult situation, they reached an agreement to establish the so-called the FIF, the Financial Intermediary Fund, for joint work between the Minister of Finance and Minister of Health. And I think this is very important because we need to anticipate, we need to prepare if one day pandemic happen and we have resources to do so. Because the way we look at the health issue in the past, especially from finance minister, was only as an expenditure. But in fact, we learn from our experience that health is an investment. So sort of like a different perspective nowadays. And we also see about the concern about this commitment towards the green economy, the climate change. So despite all this various problem and issue, I would say that there is a sort of like a common effort to improve the global situation actually.
Okay, Steve?
I always like to finish on a positive, Dino. So what I would say is that two things. The world's making the single biggest energy transition that we have seen for a long time, and we're doing so fairly successfully. There's no doubt that we are headed towards a low carbon future. And I think that that actually is a really big positive. I think that that is good for the world, and it's sustainable, and I'm quite optimistic about that. To be honest, the only thing we're really discussing or debating in countries is how quickly we get there. And in that context, I don't mind that debate because the trend, the direction is a positive. So that's a good thing. The second thing is, although we've outlined today a number of really significant and serious challenges that the world is facing, I would just reflect again, we have been in this situation before and we've been able to navigate our way through it. So I'm always optimistic about the opportunity for people to find the right pathway forward. And if we do navigate the right pathway forward, well, then we're going to have another period of strong economic growth, of high levels of employment, of people getting better educated, better health outcomes. And, you know, isn't that great? Those are really big positive things. And I think that's tremendous.
Well, thank you very much, Pa Basri and Pa Steven. This has been a very useful discussion for everybody that is listening to this. I should say that if the audience looks at my picture, Pa Basri and Pa Ciobo's picture, we all prove one thing, that people who retire from government are healthier, younger, and fresher, right? So again, thank you very much. This has been great. And for our FPCI audience, I want to thank you for tuning in. Our next topic will be on the energy security. I think that will happen sometime this month. And I also want to alert everybody that Global Town Hall, where last year we had 12,000 participants from 122 countries, will convene on the 29th of October. Yeah, still 2 months to go, but we'll keep you updated on that. Yeah. Thank you again, Steve. Thank you again, Pa Dede. Basri, great pleasure always to listen to you. Yeah. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dino. Once again, thank you, our distinguished speakers, Mr. Chatib Basri, Mr. Steven Ciobo, for the thorough observation and insightful discussion on our session titled Emerging Markets, Anticipating Strong Headwinds. A lot of questions coming in. We definitely can feel the enthusiasm from the audience throughout the session. And for that, we would like to thank everyone for tuning into our discussion. We have participants coming from 30 countries, friends from Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, US, Myanmar, South Korea, South Africa, UK, Hungary, Zambia, and a lot more. Thank you for joining us. For everyone's information, today's event is available for rewatch on FPCI official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Ladies and gentlemen, you can follow our social media handles as well for more information via Instagram or via Twitter at FPC Indo. We would also like to inform you that we just have launched our annual ASEAN-China survey, which had been conducted since 2020. This is a survey basically aims to grasp ASEAN people perception towards relation with China in various aspects. So this year, the theme of the survey is managing cooperation amidst the geopolitical tension. So ladies and gentlemen, please help fill in the survey through bit.ly/AC survey 2022, or you can also scan the barcode provided on your screen. And our team has also sent you the survey link through the chat box for you to access it by click. Your participation definitely would be an important contribution, ladies and gentlemen, for our study on ASEAN-China relations. It will take only 10 minutes of your time to fill in the survey. Once again, thank you everyone for tuning into our discussion. See you on our public discussion in the future. Goodbye.